Yes. So welcome everyone to our session. Good morning. Thank you for joining, also people online. This session is part of the 10 years anniversary of the Integrated Drought Management Program. And the purpose is to collect your views, comments, suggestions, also questions, of course, on how to scale up drought resilience with integrating knowledge and practice for the next 10 years of the integrated drought management. We will start first with a short overview with a general presentation to give a little bit of a background and setting the stage. And then we will have short presentation of the 9 work streams that we've been working on with several different organizations. And the second part of the session will be for you to actively contribute and helping us, supporting us in setting up this agenda for the next 10 years. So we are looking forward to your active contribution. Without further ado, I would like to first invite Mr. Robert Stefanski from World Meteorological Organization to give a bit of an overview on the outcomes of the high-level meeting on national drought policies, which happened back in 2013, and where we are today with the Drought Resilience +10. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina, and good morning all, and everybody online as well. Let's just go to the next one. As Sabina said, I work for the World Meteorological Organization, but more importantly, within the context of the Integrated Drought Management Program, we have over 45 partners. And so this is how we've coalesced around this meeting that we hope to have next year. So this session is really just an overview of what happened 10 years ago in March, actually as March 2013. We had the first high-level meeting on National Drought Policy in Geneva. We had over 414 participants from 87 countries. And the key message there was how do we help countries moving from reactive to proactive drought policies? While the main co-sponsors were WMO, UNFCCC, and FAO, we had many UN organizations and international and regional organizations involved as well, you can see there. And that's something we're doing again this time. So we had, this is again 10 years ago, we had a scientific segment with 9 sessions. We had breakout groups and side events. The main outcomes, we had science and policy documents. And these sort of 4 items are the basis of what we now have, the 3 pillars of integrated drought management, which was first realized in 2013. So you can see there the outputs from the meeting looking at effective drought monitoring early warning systems, risk and impact assessment, preparedness and drought mitigation actions, and also looking at emergency relief and how all that can fit into a drought plan. And the idea here is integrating and using the monitoring and early warning systems to then develop some thresholds, and then the countries can take some actions to help mitigate the impact of drought. Of course, we don't need to state what's been happening the last few years, large numbers of droughts, heat waves, and wildfires, among other climatic effects happening around the world with a bit more intensity. Again, we had a final declaration 10 years ago. You can see the same thinking there, developing proactive drought impact mitigation, planning measures, et cetera, public outreach. And this is one thing I think the program has done with the partners especially, is promote greater collaboration to enhance the quality of local, national, regional, and global observation networks and delivery systems, and improve public awareness. So this is all in the final declaration, and it's something we'll try to do again in the next meeting, hopefully in April of 2024. Again, just considering the legal framework within each country, you'll see through some of the presentations, a lot of work has been done. And I'll get to that, how we're going to plan the meeting in April of 2024. But of course, the other issue is that during the declaration, again, linking drought management plans to local development policies, and make sure that the emergency relief plans are based on sound management, not reactive, and don't put countries in a more vulnerable situation for the next drought. So in 2013, there were several initiatives that were started. The IDMP continues, and we're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. We also had the National Drought Management Policies Initiative with UN Water, Decade for Capacity Development. That was quite successful. We had a series of workshops. That organization or unit folded into something else. And we also had the World Day to Combat Desertification and Deserts back in 2013. So that was the past. Like I said, we have the IDMP program with 45 partners. And now looking to the future and the rest of the program for today is that we have now what we're calling Drought Resilience+10, the high-level meeting on national drought policies. And actually, it's more like drought plans. Again, this is not, it's getting all the ministries together, all the stakeholders, and seeing how they can make sure that agricultural needs are met. Water use, ecosystem use, urban water supplies. We now have an international organizing committee, and you'll see some of the members here. I would like to just mention the governments and Met Services of Spain and Morocco. They are part of the high-level meeting. We did have a video that we had some technical problems, but we'll put that on our website for that, and they're helping us plan the next meeting. So again, we're hoping, again, as we go through the agenda, we're looking at maybe May or April of next year. And we're soon to confirm hopefully the week and the place. So for today, we're looking at these 9 work streams. And you can see with the leading organizations, those are part of the International Organizing Committee. As we get closer to the meeting, later this year, we'll invite any interested parties who want to contribute. But this is the idea of having the 9 work streams over about 3 days. And as important, to recognize the International Drought Resilience Alliance, hosted by the governments of Spain and Senegal, and hosted by the UNFCCC Secretariat, and they will most definitely be involved as well. So that is the work stream, the agenda for today. I will talk about the first work stream and then pass it on to Tom Eisman from the Nature Conservancy, who will then moderate the rest. So quickly, what we're going to do is that each work stream just gives 1 or 2 slides, but we want to hear from you and also the online colleagues on what you think we're doing, how can we make it better. So this first work stream is on drought resilience and global mechanisms. A number of organizations working with the UNDRR had a special report on disaster risk reduction and drought. And I think this is the main challenge that we have, is that traditional risk assessment and management strategies are increasingly challenged by systemic and evolving compounding, cascading risks. And so as you can see, again, what's been happening the last few years. 10 years ago, we talked about drought, we talked about floods. I think now we're really looking at this whole stream, even with the compounding effects of drought, heat waves, and wildfires. Again, the challenge is that no 2 droughts are the same in onset, rates of intensification, duration, and extent, and there's no simple formula. So one of the ongoing challenges is how do we sustain collaborative networks across research, observations, services, and decision-making at all the different scales. And you can see all the mechanisms here that are at disposal, and so how can we make sense of this within the context of drought and a changing climate? So with that, I'll pass it to Tom. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Bob. My name is Tom Eisman. I work on water scarcity and drought issues for the Global Food and Water Program of the Nature Conservancy. And really my job is just to be a timekeeper as we work through these 9 work stream reports. We're going to try to do them all in about 3 minutes each, and then we'll have a quick Mentimeter question, so have your phones ready. And then Rachel McDonald of the International Water Management Institute will facilitate a moderated discussion essentially with the group, where we'll have a chance to ask questions and get into some of the work streams in more detail. So for our second work stream, Daniel Sigai from the UN Convention to Combat Desertification will present on drought risk governance, regional, national, and local challenges.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very much pleased to be here with you to discuss about these work streams, this work stream on drought risk governance, regional, national, and local challenge. I'm a program officer at the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, working on drought and water scarcity issues. And the issue about drought risk governance is very important. I think Bob has highlighted about moving from reactive to proactive approach to drought, moving from treating drought as a crisis into a risk. And we need to look into how we can manage drought in a more comprehensive way. So the objective of this work stream during the conference in April 2024 or May 2024 is first to provide up-to-date information on the latest research findings and trends regarding drought risk governance. How have countries been managing drought? What are the governance and options? If you go to a country, sometimes they just look into it as a sectoral approach. They just look into it maybe from the livestock sector, and drought is more for them about livestock. In some others, you look at it like as a national option, where it's like a high-level drought risk management commission, which is headed by the head of state. So the importance that countries give to drought is different in different countries. And now we want to see how can we come up with a comprehensive drought risk governance. So we are going to advocate, according to, I think there was a presentation about the global assessment report by the UNDRR risk reduction, a comprehensive multi-risk approach to drought risk management, so that we talk about drought, it's affecting every segment of the economy. It's not only about agriculture or food, it is about all kinds, the cascading impacts of drought have to be treated well, and we need to look into a system-based approach. So first, we will also identify, we are also seeking into some good papers, for example, identifying what were the main challenges when countries were discussing drought or governing drought, and encountering in achieving effective drought risk governance at different levels, whether it is global, regional, local, or national. The other thing is we are also going to discuss how to overcome these challenges. So we need to come up with what we have learned in terms of the lessons learned on how we govern drought risk, but also we can rebuild a better system, a very comprehensive system, a systemic risk approach to drought management, and a multidimensional impact, because drought is impacting every segment of the economy. So we are going to propose an integrated approach to enhance resilience at all levels, from local to global scales. And also we are also expecting to highlight some good examples on successful and emerging approaches to tools and governance models that facilitate the transition to this adaptive risk management approach. So when we talk about reactive to proactive, from crisis-based to risk-based, I think it brings about a new challenge on how to govern this risk-based drought management approach, and this work stream is going to look into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Next up, we've got Mark Svoboda, who's going to talk about drought impact monitoring, assessment, and forecasting. Mark is with the National Drought Mitigation Center.
Thanks, Tom. Good morning, everybody. Let me start with the punchline. Since we only have 3 minutes, I'll start at the end. We can't measure what we don't monitor. So drought impacts are sort of the face of drought. Where are we at risk? Where are we vulnerable? Yet we don't measure or monitor them like we do precipitation or stream flow or temperature, and that's a real gap. This shows underlying societal vulnerability, and not just in developing countries, but globally. Drought is, on average, the biggest cause of loss when you look at hazards, and definitely needs to be given more attention, and it simply is not. So how do we go about changing policymakers' thoughts on how we deal with drought? And there's some ways we can do that. So we need to prioritize impact collection of drought is the bottom line answer, if you take one thing away from this slide. So tracking drought allows us to a lot of things. Given the fluid nature of climate change, our underlying risks are fluid as much as the climate itself. So the game is changing, yet we don't have a baseline for impact collection. We don't really have a strong baseline yet that's sort of standardized or uniform or global. We have some networks here and there. We've been collecting drought impacts in the US since 2005, and we've worked with partners in EU and other groups that have been collecting impacts for a little bit now. But there's still a lot of challenges, so I think there's a lot of ground to make up. Some exciting new tools are out there to help us engage on other platforms such as social media and allow citizen science to come into play a little bit to validate our indicators, understanding the relationship between how we measure drought on the physical environmental parameters, but yet tying that into, again, that sort of underlying risk that we see on the ground at the local level with people that are affected by drought, and that's the bottom line. How do we tie those together? Obviously, it helps us identify areas where we need to respond to drought, whether that's a famine situation or a water scarcity issue or shortage. All these things tie in with drought when you look at it, and they point to our underlying vulnerabilities. So these are the things we need to address in a future impact collection system. The system we're promoting now or advocating is called Condition Monitoring Observer Reports. It's a real simple, on your smartphone, able to fill out just a couple questions. You can upload a photo, it goes into a database and is vetted, and it goes right on the maps. They can immediately see that their input into the process is there. And we can use that information to validate, again, our indicators, our models, our remotely sensed data. So really impacts are at the nexus of the three pillars. When you look at monitoring and early warning, you look at risk and vulnerability assessment, then you look at policy and planning, impacts are right in the middle and tie those, I believe, those three pillars together quite nicely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. This is quite easy. Actually, everyone's staying on time. Our next speaker will be Daniel Sigai. Again, I'll welcome him back on the need to turn drought policies into action. Daniel.
Thank you. I'm not trying to dominate anything, but I'm just here also on behalf of the colleagues from FAO because we are running this work stream with FAO. And the need to turn drought policies into action. This has its own history because at the UNCCD we have been supporting countries to develop a national drought policy based on this principle of risk reduction. About 70 plus countries have now adopted these national drought plans. And the question that comes always is, what's next? Okay, we have a policy, but not how to implement it. So the next decade, our challenge will not be about convincing countries to come up with a policy. This was the case before a few years because only a handful of countries had a national drought policy. Some countries pretend to have, but what they have is just how to react to the drought when drought strikes. But I think this paradigm shift from crisis to risk management approach has worked well, and now we have a common narrative that drought is a risk, it's a constant risk, and we need a policy, and they have the policy. So the need to turn drought policies is very, very important into action. And we made a survey with about the 70 countries, and this, what I'm presenting here, is what the countries have said. What is their challenge when it comes to turning the drought policy into action? One of the challenges is political challenge, to sensitize government to take action on drought, which is a slow onset phenomenon, although we have also some flash droughts. But compared to floods and earthquakes, which you cannot neglect or which cannot even ignore, drought is a slow onset phenomenon, and it's very difficult to convince government policymakers to prioritize it. The other one is institutional challenge. The institutionalization of drought preparedness. As I said, the usual suspects working on drought are meteorology or agriculture or environment, but when drought strikes, it's a country issue, it's a national issue, it's about health issue, finance, and everything else. So how can we institutionalize drought preparedness? And the technical challenge, of course, the technology in order to predict and monitoring and forecasting, there is a lot of demand on how to come up with this monitoring of drought early warning. Financial mechanisms, this is the elephant in the room. We know what we want to do in many cases, but we don't have the financing mechanisms. And this is also one of the options that we are looking into. How can we combat this challenge? And public engagement challenge, also raising awareness. So the opportunities also from the countries is first education and sensitization. Not only just raising awareness, but educating people about the importance of drought preparedness. It is going to become harder and faster, and we need to live with it. And this needs also a sort of a big capacity building at all levels. Enhancing water supply. I think this also goes into, of course, water demand, trying to reduce the water demand, but there was also these countries, many of them were reporting about how can we really come up with enhanced water supply mechanisms to improve the opportunities, monitoring, forecasting, and early warning, and also gender mainstreaming. Drought knows gender, and we need to really look into, because we talk about the impacts, but we don't really disaggregate gender disaggregated data, and we need to mainstream our drought policies and actions on drought based on gender and age inclusiveness, and considerations to also driving health costs. I think we have a work stream now on drought and health because it is impacting a lot the health issue also. So the opportunities, the way forward is, of course, we need to prepare for drought necessities, greater institutional capacity. Institutionalization of drought preparedness is the way forward. It is the option. And we are looking for, in this work stream, also to look into how we can cope capacity of individuals and communities to deal with drought events. And collaborative approach. Drought is not a sector, it is a connector, and it is wide, economy-wide, its impact is economy-wide. So we need a collaborative approach. Maybe we will have an opportunity to discuss it, but there is an international drought resilience alliance that is being spearheaded by the government of Spain and Senegal to look into how we can mobilize support around drought governance and international collaboration. And the benefits of action and the cost of inaction is very important. Sometimes you need to see the economics of being prepared for drought. It's not only about avoiding a disaster or minimizing the loss, but it also it makes economic sense. In some cases, there is a ratio of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5. If you are prepared for drought, it would be only 1, but if you are not prepared, then of course, if you have to react, it is expensive, inefficient, uncoordinated. So I think the benefits of action and cost of inaction is also important. And I said I want to highlight mainstreaming gender is also important in the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I know there are people here in the room who have experience in turning drought policy into action. Next up, we have a work stream that I've been working on with the Nature Conservancy. It's on ecosystems and drought, and we'll hear from Chris Magaro at IUCN. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Tom, and nice to see you also. Why do we have to talk about ecosystems in the context of drought here? That's what we'll be looking at today. So the definition of drought itself has traditionally been based on precipitation deficits, temperature. These two have, formed the discourse itself and how we perceive it. But we know that drought itself has far-reaching consequences on ecosystems. I mean, when we look at the relationship between drought and species, drought and ecosystem services, and other processes, we know that these are linked. And so within our work stream, these are the kind of links that we are looking to join the dots on. Drought itself, apart from being experienced as a matter of deficits in water and temperature, when ecosystems themselves are degraded beyond a certain threshold, you will still experience drought within a community. And it's something that we have not been talking about a lot within the realm of drought and drought responses. So what happens when we experience drought? Most of our responses and most of the country's responses are based on, the disaster cycle management. Let us go in, let us relieve the emergency situations. Let us do something about that. But this emergency frameworks, as much as they address the pain and alleviate the pain that is experienced during that time, there are other underlying issues that are still left hanging. And these are mostly, as ecosystem issues. Ecosystems themselves can be an ally in terms of addressing drought. It means that you can address restore ecosystems, you can address other drought issues by doing so. So it is a strong ally. But in so doing, we must be careful that ecosystems themselves are not exploited or overexploited for this matter. And it's not only ecosystems, it is also, we've alluded to the fact of rights and people and communities in responding to drought and in taking this approach with regards to ecosystems. It should not infringe on biodiversity, and it should not infringe also on people. So this holistic management is what we want to look at and what we want to ingrain more within the framework. My colleagues already mentioned that you cannot manage what you cannot monitor. And if ecosystems do not solidly come into the frameworks of drought management plans, then we will not be able to manage that. Looking at the opportunities that are there, so we talk about ecosystems themselves. I know we've heard about nature-based solutions, and just in passing, there are solutions that look at sustainable management, protection, restoration of ecosystem services, but not for the sake of that, just ecosystems, but they should benefit the economy, they should benefit people, and they should benefit nature. This already is an opportunity with regards to drought response in general. We can not only, we can respond to more than just only drought. We can take an approach to nature, and we can respond to multiple global goals that we have along with that. Regenerative food systems, we're talking about that now. How do we produce our food? Regenerative agriculture, what role does it play? Can we, enhance ecosystems within, regenerative agriculture practices and systems? So these are the kind of things that we will be looking for within this track. But that's not all. We are looking also to hear from you, what are the kind of thoughts, ideas you have around this, and it will be great to hear about this going forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Next up, we'll hear from Sabina again on work stream number 6 on social inclusion. Sabina.
Thank you. So Global Water Partnership, together with the International Organization for Migration and International Water Management Institute, commit to support the gender transformative approaches and social inclusion to be integrated in drought policies, and to support and to ensure climate justice through following activities: through reducing gender-based constraints, to supporting initiative mobilizing underrepresented groups in drought management, to increase number of drought policies and strategies to include inclusive dimensions, including gender transformative approach into all activities, increasing drought resilience, and increasing digital inclusion design in climate information system and services. So to mainstream climate justice into drought, we need to assure enabling conditions for social inclusion into drought governance, drought finances, and drought knowledge and capacity. By doing this, we can get everybody on board, and we can together contribute to the increase of community and societal resilience to drought. So basically, the main question that work stream 6 is dealing with is how to ensure that nobody is left behind when we manage drought. And this is something to think about also for you in the second part of the session. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and greetings from Rome. My name is Eva Peck. I'm a London Water Officer at the London Water Division of the Food and Agriculture Organization. This presentation will be a very quick overview of the work lines of Workstream 7, namely the drought finance. Mentioned earlier, losses by drought keep mounting, but despite this fact, drought finance is not yet high on the political agenda. And the financial sources for drought management are largely concentrated in public finance and are delivered through traditional mechanisms such as grants or concessional instruments. The good news, there is a solid baseline to build on. So, for example, drought finance can leverage the climate finance windows and can use the tested modalities of development finance, but very importantly, more and diversified strategies are needed, which are constructed specifically for drought finance. So what's next? What are the main directions? First of all, there is a finance gap that calls for the involvement of the private sector. But this can be done only if drought management can produce feasible business cases. This also requires the improvement of the risk-return profile, for example, by using no-regret strategies in the project designs. Then from the side of the required resources, we need innovation in financial instruments to move away from the grants and also to draw on more diversified financial sources. On the other hand, on the distribution or the demand side, the financial inclusion plays a great role in the intensification of investment, for example, by promoting digitalization in the financial sector. Finally, knowledge management, or I would rather say the finance-specific knowledge management, is essential to enhancing drought finance, for example, by communication infrastructure to make a link between financial actors and stakeholders, or to translate the scientific advances into information understandable by all. So these are the key directions of the work stream, and the objective is to mobilize means or resources to support these directions and eventually to increase the finance flows towards drought resilience. Thank you very much.
There we go. We're almost through here. We're on work stream number 8 now on public-private civil society partnerships, and Valentin will present.
Thank you very much, and yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak. So we are working from the Global Water Partnership together with the World Bank and the World Meteorological Organization to coordinate that work stream on public, private, and civil society partnerships for integrated drought risk management. I guess you all are aware what public, private, civil society partnerships are. The definition is, there are many definitions out there, but one of the definitions that we are also using for our work is that a partnership is where a private company, a civil society, and of course the government are working together to fulfill something that was traditionally considered a government domain. That can be all sorts of services. And here on the bottom, we listed some very few examples that we are currently working on, but the list is of course very long. So one idea is crowdsourcing of impact data, and we heard that already from Mark. This is done in some few countries around the world, or regions around the world, Eastern Europe, for example. In Latin America, there's countries starting that up, in the US, of course. So that is certainly something where then the civil society can help the government to do drought warnings, for example. Then, for example, another example is hydromet data from companies. Hydropower companies, for example, they of course monitor the stream flow. There are other sorts of companies that monitor precipitation and so on, and often this data is not shared. So we are also encouraging, of course, these private companies to share that data because they also profit of it. And it goes also to the civil society sector. A lot of people, like myself, for example, have a meteor station on their balcony or in their garden, and this data can also be shared. And for example, in many countries like Norway or in Germany, this data is also used then by the National Meteorological Service to improve the real measured data from the real, or from stations of the Meteo service. Other models are insurance companies that invest in resilience of farmers, for example, in order to avoid cost then when drought hits. So they invest in advance into resilience building of farmers. Of course, there is a cost, but this cost is way less than the amounts that they have to pay then during a drought to help the farmers out again. So that's an investment that makes a lot of sense for them, and of course it covers the government domain. The same holds, of course, for water-intense industries. If you think of the beverage industry, for example, they have a very strong interest in having a healthy watershed. But usually they are not maintaining that, they're just profiting from it. So we see a responsibility there, of course, of these industries to invest also in the health of the watershed so they can continue to profit, but of course also the civil society around them in that watershed can profit. And these are just very few examples. I think you all are aware of many more examples, what would be possible, but what is not done enough at the moment. And some of the barriers and challenges that we have identified so far are summarized in these 4 bullets. There is often a lack of mutual trust, especially in regard of the private sector. Beverage industry is often not seen as a trustful partner because we have the perception they are exploiting the population or exploiting water resources that are actually a public good. So there is a lot of trust building necessary. There is also a strong need to understand each other better, to come together, the civil society, the private entities, but also the government to really come up with solutions. And based on that, of course, there is a lack of legislative institutional frameworks. In some countries, we see that coming up. In Nigeria, they are doing a good work on that, but in most countries, it's still missing. And often there needs to be a kick, there needs to be some seed fund to get that really going. And that is often missing as well. So that we need to install more of these frameworks to really initiate and have a good seeding ground for this public-private civil society partnerships. And just as my last sentence, we will have 2 pages for each of the work streams currently done, and they will be publicly reviewed. So for this work stream, we really encourage you to follow us in the future and then provide your input to this work stream. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Valentin. So we're on to the last work stream. After this, get your phones ready. We're going to have a Mentimeter quiz and get some of your feedback. Then Rachel will facilitate a discussion, a Q&A about the work streams. And we will bring the list of 9 work streams back up just as a reminder. Our final speaker here on the work streams is Jesse Bell, who's going to speak on drought and health. Jesse.
Thank you. Really appreciate being here today and being able to talk about drought and health. I'm excited for this to be included. Drought has likely caused more deaths than any other climate or weather-related disaster over the last century, and that's primarily due to famine and malnutrition. Those are the documented deaths. But however, drought is very complex in how it impacts the environment, and the health impacts associated with drought are likely not well understood at this time. And one of the reasons for that is that drought is a threat multiplier. It reduces air quality, water quality, food security. It can also lead to change in vector-borne disease exposure, extreme heat, all these other different pathways that can lead to human health outcomes that are outside of just famine and malnutrition. One example of that I have up here that shows an increase in respiratory-related mortality in the United States and all those locations that are in red during drought events over a 20-year period. And so we still have a lot of work to do on understanding what populations are most at risk. What are some of these secondary health outcomes like respiratory-related mortality associated with drought? How do we more effectively communicate and educate individuals, especially health ministries and public health departments, around these types of issues? And what is needed what resources are needed to make sure that we're also protecting these populations that are most at risk? So with that, there is a real opportunity for building partnerships between health ministries and public health departments with the drought community to better understand what are some of their needs and what are some of the resources that are needed to reduce health risks, and also to be able to better identify what are the health issues in the regions that they serve. But with that, there's still a lot of opportunity and a lot of barriers to potentially overcome. Because drought primarily only has those secondary related health outcomes, it is more difficult to understand some of those relationships, so sometimes it's not always the first thing that's saw. And so one of the biggest challenges is how do we effectively engage stakeholders around this issue when we're talking about disasters? Because it's much easier to see the health outcomes associated with things like hurricanes, floods, drought, heat waves than it is with drought. And so we've done some work in this previously, where we've developed strategy documents for public health departments on engaging in some of these issues with listening sessions. And so with that, thank you. Really look forward to our conversation, and I look forward to engaging more around this drought and health related topic.
Well, thank you, Jesse. Thank you to all the workstream speakers. That was incredibly prompt and timely. Unusually so. So now we're to the Mentimeter. Please pull out your phones, scan the QR code, and respond to the quiz. We're going to ask you a question about the work streams and priorities. And then we'll have Rachel McDonald come to facilitate a discussion.
Just wait a second before we see the results so you can all scan. And the online participants, I think the link is shared via the chat. So we also invite the online participants, of course, to vote. The first 3 is enough. Of course, you can do all the ranking for all the 9, but we ask you to rank the first 3 what you think are most important. So I'll go then to the result page. How does that? Where is the? Ah, I just cannot see it here.
So good morning. I'm Rachel McDonald. I'm the Deputy Director General at the International Water Management Institute. So the part of this session has been to introduce you. We know the Integrated Drought Management Programme, and many of you will be familiar with it. You have the 3 pillars: early warning system, vulnerability and impact assessment, drought mitigation policy and response. And we have used that framework in our drought work for the last 10 years. We're now going to be able to look at that. Droughts are different these days. More countries are being impacted by drought. More people are being impacted by drought. And so this session was really looking at these are the areas that we have seen that need to come into drought management going forward. These were not necessarily prominent in what we were doing in that framework and those pillars before. So here we have the 9 of them won. Speakers, would you like to come back out onto the stage again? So this part of our session is really you. We want you to be able to feed back to us when, hopefully you will be in Zaragoza, but if you're not in Zaragoza, you will have the representatives here of those 9 pillars, those 9 areas that we will want to take into the discussions in Zaragoza. So this first part is I'm going to ask for you to ask questions or for you to add your input. Each one of those work streams, they're going to be producing a 2-pager. What's happened over the last 10 years? What are the challenges that still remain? And what are the solutions? So if you have any insight onto those 3 questions, what have we done over the last 10 years? What are the challenges? What are the solutions? If you have insight from your work, or if you have insight from what you're seeing that you want to have included into those 9 work streams, This is what we're going to do with the questions coming over. And then once we've done that bit, we're then going to open it up and to say, these are the 9 work streams we've come up with. What other work streams do you think should be in there? As we are providing a framework that is continued to be used across the world, what do you, from your experience, think should also be added? Perhaps we've missed out some ideas there. So first of all, we have monitors, we have our people in the room in the blue jackets that have microphones. So I welcome you to ask questions to our people here or to add your experiences to help them take into those discussions. Our first question here, please.
Hi, my name is Lara Nassar. I'm from Jordan. I work with SIWI. I actually have a question and a comment. From what I've realized over the past few years of work on water governance and then working more on climate risk assessments, is that in our region we tend to forget to merge or to combine the idea of water scarcity and drought. So when we do risk assessments, so for example, we're going through a climate change risk assessment right now for Yemen, and the type of information that's out there, that comes out from different organizations like IWMI, all the other organizations worldwide, do not have that connection. So once we want to get information on drought, to calculate the risk it has on wash services, for example, we tend to miss that type of information. So we tend to look at water scarcity in specific. And then when we talk to government officials in that country to tell them that drought is a high risk for climate change and it has humongous risks on wash services, for example, we tend to have a challenge in wanting to explain that because the data is only about water scarcity. So one issue is, how could we increase the link in our regions at least? How could we do better in making sure that governments understand that there's a big risk, there's a big risk for drought in specific when we only have data on water? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask first Mark and then Daniel and Bob to respond to that. It's a great question. Thank you very much. And what is water scarcity? What is drought? What is growing aridity? It's very complex, isn't it? And we've got different planning. Mark.
Thank you. It's a good first question to get the conversation going. So drought, as we heard from many of the speakers, is very integrated. And dealing with we consider drought to be a temporary feature, right, as compared to maybe Jordan, where you have an arid climate that's more permanent. And then compounding droughts simply exacerbate things like water scarcity, desertification, all these other things that play off water, water security, food security. So your point is well taken. Trying to cross those together and integrate is always a challenge. Education is always a challenge. Oftentimes, those ministries don't work together very well. This is always a challenge. Data sharing is a challenge. So we're hoping through this integrated drought risk management planning that you get credit and attribution for all entities involved to share and to get credit for dealing with the issue as complex as drought is. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Daniel to maybe talk as well about what we've done with the drought group in WASIG, which is water scarcity.
Yeah, exactly. There is a global framework for water scarcity in agriculture, which is called WASAG. It is a global framework which is being led by FAO, but we have a drought working group. Maybe 80% of the working group is here. And there are a lot of other issues also, water and migration, water and health, and a few other issues. So I think you hit the point about drought and water scarcity is a very common mistake. People try to, but we identified this issue, and we have our colleagues from WMO and GWP. We have published a paper called Drought and Water Scarcity. Drought is more temporary, and the water scarcity is about supply and the demand issues. So I think conceptually you will be able to get that paper if you just Google that paper. And if you also look into the global framework for water scarcity in agriculture, there is a lot of about what water scarcity is all about. So I think it's a good point. Thank you.
and Daniel stole my thunder. But the drought and water scarcity publication is very good. And here's the problem, though, is that, I think as Mark said, drought is temporary. Drought is temporary, water scarcity is maybe more permanent. But what we're finding, though, is maybe due to human interventions, that some areas might slide into water scarcity because of mismanagement of water. So we have like 3 case studies in the publication talking solely about drought, solely about water scarcity, and then where it starts to merge. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to see that in the future, where that line is going to be very blurred because of human interventions and or human mismanagement of water. Thanks.
So thank you very much, sir, here.
Thank you. My name is Dominic Mazumaya from the University of the Western Cape. It's a question related to what my colleague has said. We talk about droughts now, and we say we must move from being, reactive to being proactive. I hear that is even monitoring. There must be emphasis on monitoring on drought. I hear now. The problem that I have is the dilemma that is, the more we talk about the drought, the more it is delinked from the routine things that national governments must do. So, for example, we try to capacitate governments, how do you manage droughts? And as you do that, then they say, this is what we are going to do when a drought arrives. And under normal circumstances, they say, oh, no, this is for the drought. So, why are don't we run the risk that is, we could say, we don't capacitate, that is the normal management of your water, agricultural water use is actually what is more important, that is when a drought arrives. Because especially in arid and semi-arid regions, what you do every year is work that strengthen your capacity to respond to the drought. But even talk about floods, I see governments sometimes, they will actually, okay, now we declare a national emergency. Then they say, okay, we are the man for this national emergency. Once it is passed, that is it. So the risk of us drilling into them, that is, these are initiatives irrelevant when a drought arrives. This is where I find our program sometimes may run that risk. I don't know whether this is just mere ignorance of, I don't know.
So your question is about preparedness, governance, capacity, reaction, and learning.
The question is really, what can we do to minimize the risk that what we are actually sort of advocating for becomes assumed that this is just, we have to wait until a drought comes, and then we do this. And then when a drought is passed, well, let's sit down. There's something we have to do.
So this is very much pillar 3, which is about mitigation, preparedness, and response, and making sure that the best time to produce that is when it's flood, when it's raining outside, is to develop those multidisciplinary, multi-ministerial action plans on what we want to do. Mark, would you like? I know you're.
Well, you're hitting on, our middle name is the Drought Mitigation Center. So you're right, mitigation are steps that should be taken before you're in the drought. That's too late, right? You're not gonna, it's tough to deal with it when you're in it. Whatever hazard that is, that's a natural, we call it the hydrological cycle, that it's apathy until you're in the drought. So what we're trying to encourage is building that resilience up during the good years, during, storing the water, being efficient with the water, to help minimize. You're not gonna stop the drought from happening, right? It's gonna happen. How do we minimize our exposure? How do we minimize our risk to the drought to lessen the impacts? That's really one of the main aims that we would encourage. And, a lot of countries have what they call drought plans. Maybe they have water plans, maybe it's a climate change adaptation plan. The problem is the vast majority are response plans. They are not mitigation plans. Mitigation plans will have steps in there to reduce risk to future droughts, not just responding to a drought each time it happens. Then we just keep going through the same cycle every time. So this mindset has to change, not just with drought, but sometimes with other hazards too.
I think you're very much talking to it's working group 4, which is about the need to turn drought policies into actions, isn't it? And making sure that's in place for when would anybody else like to speak to this great question?
You know, just very, very quickly, and that gets to being proactive. And again, we're linking the monitoring, so we have a weekly or monthly, you know, product by some agency or university that constantly looking at the drought situation that's then linked to actions. So it has to be continuous action, as Mark said. This is not, and this is where we get from going from reactive to proactive. So it's not waiting for the crisis to happen, but doing the risk management and looking at this continuously and making sure, and this is the challenge, that the instruments of the government are not overwhelmed with just another committee. So we're trying to make sure that if there's an existing committee on climate change adaptation or whatever, disaster DRR, that we include drought within there. So it is a challenge, but that's what we're trying to do, is make it a continuous effort of looking at this.
One of the great resources of the IDMP website, but also because of the experts involved with it, the terrific drought action plans and mitigation plans that already exist, and the whole 10 steps it's taking to support a country to be able to take those actions and to be able to frame those actions, building on best practices in these 10 years of experience, or many years of experience, but encapsulated in that framework that came out 10 years ago. So hopefully that will be useful. Laura? Oh, sorry, Jesse.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that. You know, there's been a number of times where either health ministries or health departments where I've talked to them about drought impacts, and that is always one of my biggest concerns, is because it's in the middle of the drought that the public health department or the health ministry is starting to identify that this is having impacts on human health. Whereas if those materials are available beforehand, then it's implementation, and they can actually get a hold of this information in a timely fashion and be able to protect lives. Because by the time you're seeing the health impacts, that's already too late. You need to be doing this before it's actually, before it's actually impacting your populations.
Okay,
Thank
Laura.
you. Laura Turley from the Geneva Water Hub. Thanks, it's been so fascinating to learn about the cooperation and the 9 different work streams. I have 2 questions and a comment, so I'll try to be brief. But the first question is, most governments, either at the national or subnational level now, have in order allocation priorities for water use. And often this is just kind of sitting in the background, except for when there are water events such as drought. So I would be curious to know if that sort of thinking about how to operationalize different water allocation priorities, if that comes through in any of the work streams. The second question is just noting that there is no, from what I've heard, work on kind of migration or displacement. Just be curious to know about that. And finally, on the working group on social inclusion and justice, I think just from our work, working on water cooperation as a lever for peace, water cooperation for peace in times of relative peace and in terms of conflict and armed conflict. What we think is that there's a real opportunity to bring in both concepts from sort of international law and international principles of sustainable development, of reasonable and equitable use, but then it's also important, essential to have these kind of bottom-up understandings of equity and justice and what they mean in times of extremes. Something I just would like to propose is this idea of kind of hybrid equity approaches that take into account and try to appreciate both in these kind of processes.
Thank you, Laura. So 3 questions there. One is about allocation priorities in countries, and often it's the strategic reserve is for human consumption at the end. But what about what's your experiences across the different countries you've worked on that? The second was about how we're including migration. I think it's in work stream 6, but we're going to ask Sabina to talk to about, and then about equity. Who'd like to talk about allocation priorities? What have you seen? And I always think ecosystems are even further down the line, aren't they, of where they are. Allocation priorities, anybody?
I mean, in general, that would have to be, that'd have to be involved in the drought plan and working with the ministries of water. So we, again, as Rachel said, we have this 10-step plan, but each country is different, and so their needs and who they're talking to are going to be different. So that's what we would find that. So we do really advocate, as we see here, with all the different disciplines of all the organizations you see on the stage, likewise, to do that in each country. And we know that's hard. It doesn't matter how big or small a country is, but getting people to talk to one another across ministries, it's actually, I think we're going to make it a work stream, just how to get people to talk to one another, because that's the biggest issue. But that's where that would be, the water allocation would be in a plan somewhere, whether it's a dam, a water resource manager, or whatever, depending on the region in the country.
Okay, migration? Yes. Do you want to use the microphone?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, one of the partners that's working on this work stream is International Organization for Migration, so this topic is definitely included, although maybe it wasn't pointed out during the short presentation. And about your, let's say, suggestion, basically, yeah, really good. Thank you for that. As Valentin mentioned, actually, it's going to be a public process or public consultation going on these work streams, like what else to be included. These 2 pages will be prepared, so that would be opportunity actually to include missing topics or
case studies or anything like that. Anybody else like to talk about allocation or migration or equity?
I could, go ahead, Daniel. Go ahead. Well, I would say, in health, migration is a big concern, obviously, because that becomes a public health issue. All of a sudden, when you have a displaced population, and not only that, it's difficult in monitoring what are the potential health impacts as well, because when it's at the site or location, it's not easy, but it's easier to understand what are the potential health impacts there. But all of a sudden, if the population moves over here, you're not necessarily knowing what are the potential health impacts happening because they're out of that area and not being monitored in the same way as well. So it's definitely of a major concern as far as health.
I just want to add, I think in this water allocation priorities, it's one of the steps that we go through. For example, when a country is going through this national drought planning process, they first have to establish a National Drought Risk Management Commission. The second one is operational definition of the objective of the drought plan. So I think this is where they will outline how are they going to be prioritizing water allocation. I think this is a good point. For example, if you go to a few drought-prone countries where they are promoting some water-intensive crops, it is a bit scary and concerning. So I think this is when they are going through this implementation of their national drought plans, one of the things that they are going to do is what is my priority, what is my comparative advantage, and how can we also allocate water resources. So this is already included when they are doing these national water drought plans. Thank you.
And I think what's very important about those national drought plans is that it's usually multi-ministerial. I know some of the, where we have worked with Nebraska, we've gone into a country and we've spoken to stakeholders and they were just saying, in last year's drought, do you know the water people just turned off our irrigation water? We put the crops down, we'd invested in the seeds and the fertilizers, and they just turned off the water. There was no pre-planning, there was no conversation about there is a drought coming down, so please don't sow your crops. So it's absolutely needed. What are the allocation priorities? And then what are the warning systems to help those that are sort of at the bottom of, the ones that are going to have the water turned off first? I saw a question here. Yes, please.
Hi, good morning. I'm Camille Klimlam-Tooten. I'm the Commissioner for the Bureau of Reclamation in the United States. I had a question on your first post of drought impact monitoring, assessment, and forecasting. How are you taking into account, as part of this, some of the other inputs such as soil moisture content, early melting of snowpack, less SWE, and then as you go into a forecast within a water season, adapting to that for evaporation? These are things that we are seeing in the real time where perhaps the historical trends are no longer what we're seeing in the last 20 years, let alone the last 10 years. So as you're looking at the drought impact monitoring, how are we looking into refining those type of forecasts for water managers across the globe?
Thank you very much. And it was a conversation we had yesterday at our IDMP meeting yesterday, and it's about drought is not just rainfall, it's soil moisture, vegetation stress. Mark, would you like to speak to that question?
Yeah, so being intimately familiar with that question, thank you. working and been to Boulder City many times to speak with Bureau of Reclamation. In the case of the U.S. drought monitoring, we're using in situ modeled satellite to look at SWE, snow water equivalent, for those in the audience that may not know that acronym. Always a challenge, but where the impacts also come in is to validate those products. So that I didn't talk about it much. I showed a map up there with a bunch of dots during my talk for impact collection. That comes from practitioners, that comes from agricultural producers, communities, watershed, water managers. It's ranchers, farmers, you name it. They have the opportunity to report the impact, and it's going to go up. Now, what happens with the impacts once that comes in as point data is we bring it into the geospatial arena with the GIS, and we can overlay it onto things like SWE or fire areas or you name it. And soil moisture, for example, is another one. So we integrate in several dozen indicators, and then the impacts are often used to collaborate or validate those, corroborate, I should say, or validate those indicators.
And that soil moisture is so important, and there's a question here. Oh, sorry, Daniel,
It's okay.
whilst we're handing over the mic, no, okay.
Okay, we're all set?
Yes, we're fine, great.
Hi, everyone. I am Charles Scaife. I'm from the U.S. Department of Energy. I'm a hydrologist there. I lead a bunch of our national scale assessments on drought impacts on things like hydroelectric production. I'm thinking about drought from all different scales, from watersheds to the national scale. I'm sure you're going to guess what I'm going to ask about in terms of the intersection of drought, but I'm curious if you're thinking about the energy connection, right? There's a huge piece that we all rely on, and that, you know, at least from the US energy portfolio, right, regionally it varies, and there are some areas where they rely on water to generate power, and so that becomes a really huge piece and something that we're really sensitive to. And I'm wondering how you're sort of considering that arc in some of this framework. Thank you.
Brilliant question. Last year in France, it's not even just HEP, it's last year in France, the rivers were so low that couldn't cool the nuclear power plants. There were blackouts because it was 40%, and it comes out in many different ways. And as we move towards green hydrogen or increased solar power, there's lots of connections with energy. Bob?
No, I think the same, thanks for the question. I think the same, when you have a drought plan, depending what it is, a watershed or whatever, is making sure that the needs of the hydropower are needed. And I think it's a challenge. I'm not a hydrologist, agrometeorologist, but you have all the competing needs of that water, right? So you have the ecosystems, high urban water supply, energy generation, and then irrigation for agriculture. So again, getting all those stakeholders in the same table. And again, with the drought plan, going through the steps, saying what are the priorities, and then they have to hash it out. And especially in the United States in some areas, they probably still haven't hashed it out, right? It takes a long time. So again, that's what we advocate in other countries. So that's just making sure that's in the mix of all this. Your point actually, we do actually, in WMO, I lead a team on agrometeorology, health, and energy, actually, looking at the energy resources. So maybe that's something we can consider in one of the work streams. And that's what we're trying to flush this out, is that maybe we put energy in one of those work streams as a needed sector. So that's one thing that's the next step we're going to do for the meeting next year. But that's an excellent point on the hydro generation.
Mark, he was going to say something.
Yeah, just real quick on that too. In our impact collection effort, energy is its own. We do try to capture that sector. I know for FERC relicensing of these plants, they look at drought. They look at the drought monitor. The other things I would mention, as you know better than I do, I'm sure, is that shift of hydropower need in the West has really changed over the last 20 years. But the other things you might not think about on fisheries, endangered species, water temperature from the effluent, that changes makeups and ecosystems, which, Chris could speak to better than I would as well. So definitely on our radar.
Definitely. Okay, we've got, very quickly,
Yeah, just wanted to add, energy is a very important impacted sector of drought, but there are many others that we are not listing, like tourism, there is riverine transport, there is the economy in general, production of microchips. All these things are really heavily impacted by drought. And of course, we cannot do 20 work streams on everything impacted. So this is the idea that we really try to include all these impacts, not just look on agriculture for each of these 9 work streams, but look in this broader sense on all the impacts and understand drought in its full complexity.
Quickly with Daniel, and then we have some questions there, please.
I just agree with what Valentin said. This work stream 2 on multi-risk governance systems on drought is what is it going to cover? Maybe the systemic risks, the systemic approach to drought management is energy, transportation, health, tourism, and everything else. So how can we look at drought as a systemic risk is one of the work streams, and it's going to cover it all. Maybe I just wanted to say something about the Intergovernmental Working Group on Drought, because I just wanted to use the opportunity. It is becoming a big issue, and the parties at the UNCCD, 196 countries plus the European Union, came together to establish an Intergovernmental Working Group on Drought. And they are looking to see how we can manage drought sustainably under the UNCCD. And they are looking into many, many options, looking from the innovative financing mechanisms and how can we elaborate on financing mechanisms, whether maybe look at it as a legally binding or non-legally binding issues. Should we go for a global target on droughts as simple as the climate 1.5? What is our drought resilience target globally, global work program? So there are a lot of issues. If you would Google Intergovernmental Working Group on Drought, you will be able to see what are the options that are being considered, and I think this will be a game changer on what to do drought at the global level. Thank you.
So as we take the last questions, can you use the Mentimeter that you had before? We have a new one, and it exactly speaks to your question, Chris. What else do we need? We've given you 9 work streams. What are the other work streams we should be developing insight in to take into the Integrated Drought Management Program conversations? There was a question here, Madam? This.
Thank you. My name is Precious Sibia from TCTA South Africa.
Okay.
My question is with regards to the issue of water scarcity and drought. The drought is a short term, and then water scarcity is long term. Isn't that a contributing factor when we see resistance in a lot of spaces that we put this forward? Because where I am coming from, we are at a stage where a lot of things happened when it was drought, and then now it comes to water scarcity. Surely we should, whenever we are talking on this forum, we need to combine the two. Because if we are not talking about both of them, I, as someone who is out there, will say, I'm not going to invest in something that is short term. Shouldn't we talk about both of them? Because other countries, based on any other reasons, they are already there, coming from the drought to the water scarcity part. So I just wanted to confirm for that, to say that resistance, can we not experience it if we combine the two, rather than focusing on the short-term aspect, which is the drought? Thank you.
A great question, and what we do know is drought is always, it's uniquely defined relative to local conditions. So if you already have water scarce conditions, drought is defined relative to that. There isn't a sort of a universal term for that. Would anybody like to talk to, again, water scarcity and drought? Bob?
Very quickly, what's interesting is that actually the measures and the mitigation factors, or measures, sorry, are the same for both, actually. So it's a good point. That's something to take in consideration. We go to a lot of countries, and there is some confusion between the two terms. It's something we, maybe are struggling with. We did this, document on drought and water scarcity, trying to look at them and then how they interact or how they merge into one another. It's a complex issue, so something that we can take forward, I think, considering for the meeting next year.
Absolutely. So these are some great inputs here. I love the fact that groundwater, water storage is the one here. In other words, mitigating drought risk. What can we do? I mean, a lot of it we've been looking at, there's this hazard, how do we deal with the vulnerability, but by mitigation, having water storage, might be small on farm, might be larger ones, groundwater, water ethics, catchment management. So there's lots of really good ideas coming into here. Energy trade-offs, These are all ideas that we will take into the planning for the sessions and the planning of what will go into the next framework going forward. We are coming to an end to this part of this session, so I do want to thank the working group leads for all their insight, for their questions they've taken, but also we asked them in 3 minutes to summarize major periods of work that they've done, so I think we'd like to thank them first. And then to finish up, we have 2 speakers to finish up. We have Harriet Adiambo Okal from the World Youth Network. Droughts are going to be something that our water leaders of today and of the future are going to be dealing with. So Harriet, we'd love you to come and give your insight on there. And then Roger Stone, who is someone with very rich experience, will then help summarize it at the end. Is Harriet here? Oh, okay. So we'll ask Roger to come first, sorry, and then, actually that was the way, wasn't it? And then Harriet will then close out for us from the World Youth Network. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, I think Harriet is joining us from South Africa, which will be wonderful. So I'm just going to make a very quick summary. I'm a professor in climate science from Australia, by the way, so where we have droughts. So it's a quick summary of the measures. I don't know whether it may be worth putting the work streams back up again just to refresh our collective memories. Very briefly then, I think some of the key messages that came to me particularly were the words such as resilience and the more strategic approach. If you want the work streams, I can put them up. Okay. I'll talk to this microphone. The word resilience, the fact we need to take much more proactive approaches and approach this issue rather than have what's often been described or sometimes described as proactive reactivity. So instead of having a system in place to become reactive, we actually have a system that is proactive and is able to meet these challenges when they arise. I think that's one of the key discussion points that came out. So the key term was the word resilience. So the very first work stream there is drought that Bob presented on very well on drought resilience and global mechanisms, this compounding and cascading risks that doesn't often get spoken about. It's more than the drought itself. The risks continue right through various stages of the economy and the communities particularly, and no simple formula to manage all the risks. Daniel spoke about drought risk governance at regional, national, local challenges. And there's this key issue of the whole multi-risk approach that's needed, a systems approach. And it's not that easy. We often speak about systems approaches, perhaps in the scientific community, but it's occasionally difficult with public policy folk or with politicians to actually describe exactly what we're speaking of here. So I think it's a particularly important work stream there. Then Mark, of course, introduced the particularly valuable area of drought impact monitoring assessments and forecasting. Forecasting droughts is a particularly difficult thing to do. We can't measure what we can't monitor. I'll say that again. We can't manage what we can't measure and monitor. It's a good take-home message, I believe. But Mark was also, I think, one of the few speakers that brought the issue of climate change to a head there. Just as we're flat out managing drought at the moment, preparing for drought, with our current levels of climate variability, how on earth are we going to manage it under climate change? So we have some major issues there, major issues to address, I think, to combine the climate change issues, particularly in the forecasting realm, just as we're getting our forecasting models up to scratch, and they're multi-layered forecasting models, systems approaches. Climate change is actually challenging the capability of some of those inputs. The particularly important point that Daniel made on the need to turn drought policies into action. Slow onset, there are countries with drought plans, but the whole slow onset of droughts and the need for financing means that these areas can become adrift as we try to make these things work within government. What if we don't have a major drought for 10 years? What happens to the financing and so on? What happens to that drought plan that might be gathering dust in the bottom shelf somewhere of a government department, or similar approach? Ecosystems drought. This is often, I think, that Chris brought out particularly well, the forgotten nature of droughts. Who looks after our ecosystems? in times of drought. I mean, we're looking at, and deservedly so, our farmers and our water allocation systems, but our ecosystems are struggling at the same time. And so the key point, of course, is a holistic approach is needed here. We need a management of drought consider biodiversity, economy, and people. So nature is a strong ally, which I think is a good message to make in this area. But who looks after our ecosystems and our animals and so on, and in our national parks and so on and so forth? The whole issue of social inclusion and climate justice that Sabina addressed there, reducing gender-based constraints and so on. I think this also perhaps includes some of the aspects related to one of the key questions asked towards the end there about migration and I added civil unrest that's associated with drought and leading to, as a tipping point, you might say, in many parts of the world at critical times. A very interesting area that Eva introduced was drought risk finance and insurance sort of issues. This is, I found personally an interesting area that's gathering a little bit of interest, if I may say, from Germany. Actually, the German government seems to be very proactive in this area for the finance section to play its part, in this whole area. It's not yet on a political agenda in many areas, but some are taking the lead. It introduces this whole issue of residual risk. So if agencies and governments and local communities and farmer organisations have developed a more resilient approach to managing drought in the first place, if they can do that, that reduces the residual risk that's then able to be much more appropriately taken up by insurance and reinsurance agencies. It's a much more attractive proposition if some sort of process has been made towards long-term resilience within that farming community. For example, I know this is taking place with the coffee industry in Vietnam at the moment. That's a nice example, but supported by the German government, which I think deserves some recognition. Finally, the whole drought and health issue. This is a lot very often forgotten area, the whole issue of heat waves. Actually, I'm not sure if heat waves were mentioned. The heat waves usually associated with droughts in a particularly severe way. Someone mentioned that heat waves cause more deaths than the droughts itself and so on in the population. But I'm also aware, as I was discussing over coffee before, that when droughts hit in country areas and farming communities, there's a massive increase in suicides, in farmer suicides. So the whole health aspects associated with drought are often hidden. It's a hidden statistic that's sitting back there somewhere. So an interesting, very interesting, complex area, rich tapestry of drought preparedness and mechanisms that are in place with this approach that I believe. The interesting of water scarcity and drought, I think, is particularly important versus drought, if I may say. The water allocation issue is particularly sensitive in many areas of the world, and because we have different policies from state governments within federal agencies, I've noticed whether the natural environment is protected at the expense of farmer well-being and community well-being. Communities and towns can collapse because there's no water allocation to keep that farming enterprise that supports that town moving, because that water's been allocated for other needs. So I think that water allocation issue could be picked up in the work streams. It's mine, it needs to be particularly so. So that's my short summary of the summaries, and now hopefully we can pass on to Harriet and Bob. Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Oh, there's Harriet. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Harriet. I only know your first name, so from Grahamstown, I think in a long way away in South Africa. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. My name is Harriet, as Prof has said, Harriet Ademba Okal. I am a PhD student at the Institute for Water Research, pursuing hydrology at Rhodes University in South Africa. I'd like to thank the conveners and especially IDMP for creating this youth space in this conversation. I'm rather intimidated to be speaking after all these distinguished experts and seasoned and established researchers, some of who I personally look up to. But thank you so much for giving us this space to share the perspectives of the youth in the Drought Resilience+10 initiative, as well as the broader issue of drought management. I'm not only representing the Water Youth Network, but I'm also presenting the voices of the youth across all sectors and borders, and to give just some of our intervention ideas on what can be included in the next Drought Resilience +10. Just to paint a picture, an estimated 55 million people globally are affected by drought every year, and these are statistics by the WHO. A statement I like very much: early warning systems and action saves lives. For those who know this statement, and for also those who don't know, these are the words of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He made this statement during the World Meteorological Day last year. And here, the World Meteorological Organization was then mandated to spearhead the new actions to ensure every person on Earth is protected by early warning systems within 5 years. And of course, this includes the early warning systems for drought. And that is why we are having this conversation today. The perspectives of the youth is very crucial, as we, the young people, are not only directly infected or affected by drought, but we also represent the societies of the future and the future environment. Something I normally say is that this generation of youth is a powerhouse, because the generation before us, the generation that lived longer, they actively lived in a different climatic setting. And then there's this new generation who are born into this climate that we are living in right now. But as the youth, we have actively lived and we're actively living through this transition. So climate change is our second name. To some of the interventions and ideas that we can give or we can participate in this initiative is that we, as a powerhouse and drivers of this initiative at all levels, we place a significant role in raising awareness about droughts, as well as its impact among our peers, families, and communities. We can engage in educational campaigns, workshops, and social media to share information about drought resilience and adaptation strategies. Also, as the world is rapidly changing, we, the youth, are more often adaptable to technological innovations, because we can contribute to fresh ideas and innovative solutions to address drought challenges, such as developing mobile apps for drought monitoring, as well as using remote sensing and technology for early warning systems, something that I am personally very passionate about. We, the youth, can also mobilize communities at local levels for action against drought, as well as advocate and influence policies at all levels, both locally and internationally, to ensure that the voices of the vulnerable populations, as well as the ecosystems, are represented in drought management decisions. When it comes to climate action, we, the youth, can participate in global climate strikes, peaceful global climate strikes, organize awareness campaigns, and demand climate action from the government and businesses. We can also foster collaboration and network among our peers to share experiences, best practices, and solutions for tackling drought and all the challenges that it comes with it. So this collaboration within our peers, the experts, those who work at the hydromet services, the finance, the agricultural sectors, as well as researchers, those in academia and research institute where I lie in, we can bridge the gap between scientific knowledge, traditional knowledge, as well as practical action to provide innovative solutions grounded on scientific research. Most importantly, we, the youth, can inspire behavioral change in our communities. So our participation is not only crucial for implementation, but also for sustainability. This is to ensure that the next generation is well prepared to address these challenges. Therefore, I would like to invite all participants and youth and young professionals. I've seen that there are a lot of participants in the room, as well as those who are online. I'd like to call upon all of you to participate in this Drought Resilience +10 initiative, because we have to have a seat at the table in conferences, as well as during these different initiatives, such as the Drought Resilience +10, because our zeal, enthusiasm, energy, and fresh perspectives can offer fresh insights to help shape effective strategies for building drought resilience in this rapidly changing world, and to help communities prepare for climate-related hazards such as drought for the overall building of a drought-resilient future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harriet, so much. And I think with that, eloquent words, we will end the session. Again, we want your input on issues on drought, especially the Drought +10 Drought Resilience meeting next year. We have the banner here, droughtmanagement.info. You can contact any of the speakers, myself, Valentine. So thank you so much. We're trying to keep on time because we know it's a packed session and the World Water Week is just starting. So again, thank you, Harriet, and thank you all, everybody online and in the house. Thank you.